So now we're going to move on to taxes and subsidies. Taxes and subsidies in economics, when we use them in the diagram, there's a simple way to do it, as you might have discussed or as we might have talked about before, where if, say, this is the market for bread, and we say there's a tax on bread, that makes it more expensive to produce bread. So the supply curve shifts up and to the right, or up and to the left. So the supply curve shifts up and to the left. The price of bread increases and the quantity of bread exchanged in the marketplace decreases. So that's simple enough and that's straightforward, right? Note that makes sense. If you tax bread, naturally the price will rise. If you decide to tax bread, then less will exchange in the market. It's not more expensive. So far, so good. But what's different about thinking in taxes? Well, this is like a valid sort of first way to think about it. You know, we put taxes here, and it does seem to make sense. There's a little bit of weirdness here because the tax did not have to exist. The tax was something that was placed as a matter of the law onto a market that was otherwise functioning fine. We'll talk later about how taxes can be used to correct pre-existing problems with the market. But when the market is functioning fine, this is a supply and demand curve, there's equilibrium prices, equilibrium quantity, there's no inherent problem. When you decide to create a cost that didn't have to exist, you create a problem. You create deadweight loss. And so we should really rethink this diagram, not as, oh, it's a tax on bread, I mean, that's a fine for first attempt, but there is a deeper, more fundamental way to think about it. While some markets might see an increase in the supply curve, a shift up in the supply curve by some genuine change in cost structure, wages might be going up, shipping costs might be going up in the market for bread, flour might be getting expensive. That price should be higher to reflect the changing market circumstances. That is the result of the marketplace reallocating resources in that decentralized, spontaneous sort of way. But when a government imposes some sort of change into the marketplace by law, by fiat, that did not have to exist, then we should do a different way. So we have a 20-cent vertical distance that I want to impose. Now, like I said, let's imagine we are taxing bread production. So we take that 20-cent vertical distance and we'll, this is taxing bread production, we'll put it on the supply curve right here. Now, this is not what you're supposed to do. I am sort of showing you what you're supposed to do by showing you what you're not supposed to do. In other words, if we do this, you'll see that this is not what the equilibrium is. So if we do it this way, like these suppliers here will still be, I mean, they won't be happy, but they will produce bread and then give the government at the normal price, give the government its 20-cent tax and walk away and still collect a profit. These suppliers right here because the distance between the price and their costs is less than 20 cents, they would not be willing to produce. However, there are some demanders, some consumers over here who really, these specifically, who really want that bread. And so they are willing to pay a very high price for it. And these producers realize that if they increase the price of their bread, they can have these consumers shoulder some of that cost, some of that tax. In other words, even though the law says that it's going to go on the suppliers, in practice, the suppliers can raise their prices and shoulder some of that onto the consumers. How much? Well, we can find out by wedging in this distance. So this is called the wedge method, where you take that vertical distance and then you hammer it in onto the left or from the left. And that determines the price consumers pay, P sub D. That's this price up here. The price suppliers get, or producers get, that's this price down here. We have a new equilibrium quantity, which is right here. And that is, of course, distinct from an optimal. So just like before, right, we have a lower quantity. We have a lower quantity here. Just like before, we have a higher price that people have to pay. There's a higher price people have to pay. Here, we sort of argued that the producers get that price. And they do, technically. But now we're acknowledging that that price, a chunk of that price, is passed on to the government. And this box, that box is tax revenue. Now remember, we talked about the importance of that distinction between what people naturally do, Q sub E, the equilibrium quantity, and what we want people to do, Q sub star, or Q star, it's not Q sub E. QE, the equilibrium quantity, and Q star, the optimal quantity. What people are naturally going to do and what people ought to do. What we want the market to do and what the market what we want the market to do and what the market wants to do, given these circumstances. And in these manipulated circumstances, the natural tendency is to pull away from the optimal, creating deadweight loss. Because it is these individuals, with this person, might only value, bread at, say, 90 cents or something like that. That's not good. Probably, bread is a lot more expensive than 90 cents. We'll say $2 for bread. He values it at $2, and this person can produce bread at $1.90. Well, that's a 10-cent difference. You can't find a way to split that 20-cent tax if there's only a 10-cent difference. There is an artificial manipulation of the market that prevents that otherwise mutually beneficial transaction from taking place. Dollars on this point right here. $1.90. And because the benefits are greater than the costs, but we do not consume, we do not produce exchange, we call it deadweight loss. So I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm going to deepen it a little bit. I'm also going to make my diagram a bit bigger to make sure you can see it. One of the things that this wedge method teaches us is that it doesn't depend on who shoulders the tax. Are consumers paying a higher price, or are producers getting a smaller profit? Who shoulders the tax does not depend on the law. It depends on who has the most tolerance for higher prices or lower profit. And that depends on elasticity. To illustrate, consider the market for cigarettes. Think about what the demand curve for cigarettes look like. Is it elastic or inelastic? It's probably inelastic, right? If you need cigarettes, there's not a lot of substitutes. There's vaping now, so I suppose it's a little more elastic than it used to be. But it's, it's still pretty limited substitutes. So I'm going to make it pretty, you might argue that's not as inelastic as this, but I want to illustrate the point. So now, consider the production of cigarettes. Oh, this is harder. There's probably not that much flexibility of production. I imagine a lot of the equipment is pretty specialized to cigarettes. But, if we're thinking about, because we're going to think of the whole world, and we're imagining, say, a tax that just one country has, well, even though you might be locked into producing cigarettes, you can always just sell them abroad. So making it more local makes it more elastic. So And then we go down our little list. Inputs are readily available. That's certainly true. You know, it's just paper and tobacco and a few other things. So I want to make it kind of more elastic. And the nice thing about making it elastic too for our purposes is it's going to really illustrate this point of who shoulders the tax more. Now, you might argue I made that maybe a bit too elastic, and I made the demand curve a bit too inelastic. But again, I want to emphasize what the exercise, what this wedge method does. So let's imagine that people get really mad at tobacco companies and that they want to make them pay. So they'll say, we're going to tax cigarettes. And tobacco companies obviously realize, because it's their industry, they know this well, that if they increase the price of cigarettes, they can sort of move that tax onto consumers. So we wedge that tax in. I'm going to make it a pretty big tax to emphasize what's going on. Note before, this purple triangle right here was consumer surplus. This purple triangle was consumer surplus. Right. Now it's much smaller. Now it's this right here. This triangle was producer surplus. So this was consumer, this was producer surplus. Now it's much smaller. Now it's this little triangle right here. The vast majority of the tax, even though it's targeted on producers, are shouldered by consumers because consumers have a much more inelastic demand curve than producers have an elastic one. The inelasticity is much higher for the demand side, therefore the demand side shoulders most of the tax. Don't get me wrong, producers shoulder some of the tax, right? They used to collect this price, now they're collecting this lower price. But consumers obviously shoulder the vast majority of it. That big purple consumer surplus triangle is reduced. Some of that goes to tax revenue. Some of that goes to deadweight loss. That kind of smaller, flatter triangle for producers. Some of that went to tax revenue. Some of that went to deadweight loss. They have a smaller one. So we think about producer surplus, consumer surplus, it shrinks. Some of it will be allocated to tax revenue because the government collects this money, but some of it just results in people not being able to trade. And therefore we have, oh, I forgot to include my equilibrium quantity and optimal quantity. Thus, the ultimate takeaway from this wedge method. Who pays the tax doesn't depend on who the law says should pay. That's just, that doesn't matter. That's like saying the government, that's like when a law is passed saying you can't charge any more for a gallon of gas or a bottle of water or some hand sanitizer. That's fine if that's what the law says, but that doesn't change the market realities. It doesn't change the reality of what's going on. And the reality of what's going on is that people can shift around. They can shift some of that tax onto the producer. And similarly, consumers can shift some of that tax onto producers. If there was a tax on movie theaters, there's lots of substitutes for movie theaters, lots of substitutes for entertainment, and you will, even if the tax is targeting consumers, you will see a lot lower prices for movie theaters as movie theaters struggle to stay afloat. Of course, some won't exist at all, but those that continue to exist, you'll see a lot lower prices because it's a lot harder for them to switch out of movie theaters. Right? That's an inelastic supply curve. Yeah, it seems pretty. I would suspect it's pretty inelastic. Certainly more inelastic than the demand curve. Right? What matters, as mentioned, is the elasticity, the relative elasticity of supply and demand. Right? Go back. Remember when I said like this is our foundational diagram? We're going to use this a lot this semester. I wasn't kidding. Supply and demand come up a lot in micro. A lot. Now, if you're thinking, wow, it really sucks to be on the inelastic side of things, and you can see why it makes sense that inelastic supply is kind of locked into, or demand, the more inelastic side. Right? Who pays more is determined by whoever is more inelastic. It kind of sucks to be stuck in that. The thing is, what is problematic on the tax is beneficial for the subsidy. Same goes for who gets more of the subsidy. So, let me show you that one. Okay, here's our diagram. Let's imagine that some very clever lobbying by the tobacco companies not only get rid of the tax on tobacco, on cigarettes, but they also create a subsidy. They get Congress to pass a subsidy for them. So rather than being taxed to produce, they're being paid to produce. Right? Rather than giving money to the government for every cigarette they make, the government gives them money for every cigarette they make. Well, if a tax reduces production, in other words, a tax is wedged in from the left, a subsidy increases production. So a subsidy is wedged in from the right. So I wedged it in here. Note that now supply is greater than demand, which makes sense. This is how much producers get. And then there's an additional from purchasing stuff, and then there's an additional amount that the government makes up. And consumers only have to pay that much. They have to pay a lot lower price. Diagramming this is a bit tricky. Showing everything here is a bit tricky because there is now an overlap. Before, there was a consumer surplus that was a split up between these different forces. Now there is a deadweight loss, a total cost of subsidy, and an increase in producer surplus and an increase in consumer surplus, and they're all kind of overlapping with each other. So I'm going to say right now, this box is the cost of the subsidy. Right? It's how much how much money the government gave the company or the consumer or wherever they gave them, how much money the government paid per unit times the number of units. Just like the tax revenue was how much the government taxed per unit times the number of units. All right, we got an area there, we got an area here. So this is the cost of the subsidy. However, the subsidy is encouraged production that we wouldn't want to have because it's a cost that's far greater than demand, than the benefit. So usually when we had deadweight loss, it was because there was too little produced. Now we have deadweight loss and there is too much produced. When does the government subsidize industries? Well, they subsidize lots of industries. There are corporate subsidies. There are agricultural subsidies. There's subsidies for education. There's subsidies for healthcare. Those subsidies might accomplish other goals besides economic efficiency, but in the context of economic efficiency, it creates waste. Okay? The costs here are relatively high, right? So right here, this quantity, the benefit is relatively low. We are producing, even though it is greater than the optimal. That's deadweight loss. Let's talk about what happens with consumer and producer surplus. Well, before, surplus was right here, producer surplus was right here. This relatively small triangle. Now is much larger. So this sort of trapezoid here, that's an increase in producer surplus. There was a price here that they were getting, this triangle. Now they're getting this larger triangle. However, so it's pretty small, but most of the benefit goes to demanders, goes to consumers. There aren't a lot of substitutes for cigarettes, which means if you wanted cigarettes, you were already smoking cigarettes. So the ability to expand this market is pretty limited. So when you start subsidizing it, then competition between demanders, between consumers, is pretty low. Competition between suppliers, which is a very easy industry to get into, right? We made it very elastic. Competition between suppliers forces huge decreases in price. So this is an important dimension of the idea that the relative elasticity cuts both ways. Besides, because it was hard to leave, consumers shouldered most of the tax. But because it's hard to leave, it's also kind of at maximum. It's hard to get into because there's fewer people to draw on. There's fewer people to join the cigarette craze. So as a result, in the bargaining power of the market, consumers are able to get very, very low prices. Right? There's a lot more producers now. There's still about the same number of consumers. Prices fall. Right? Production very easily increases. So prices radically fall. And so they get a much bigger one. And I'm running out of colors, so I'm just going to do this in black. I don't want to do it in blue. I'm going to do it in black. So this part goes to consumer surplus, and remember this dividing line doesn't really matter because it's something that doesn't apply anymore. It's before we started subsidizing this market. So essentially, this subsidy. So essentially, this subsidy. There's a hunk of money. Some of it goes to the producers. A big hunk goes to the consumers. And then another hunk goes to just flushing it down the toilet, essentially. Getting people to do things that we wouldn't otherwise do. In other words, the cost of subsidy is the purple area plus the red area plus the black area. So you see, that's how we do taxes and subsidies. It's to do it really well, to really drill down and see what's going on, you need to do more than just shift supply the right way. Right? To understand all the different players at hand, you can see, oh, there's actually a cost. And that comes from the government. Or there's actually a revenue, and that goes to the government. And in the process of manipulating this market, which is totally optional, you create deadweight loss. Now, again, taxes and subsidies don't always, under all circumstances, create deadweight loss. They create deadweight loss when the market is working well. But if there's a problem with the market, if there's what we call market failure, then they can actually fix deadweight loss. But to understand how they fix deadweight loss, we have to understand market failure, which we'll cover next video.